In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where gossip flows as freely as the tea in Miss Marple's parlour, a single letter can unravel a mystery long buried. When Jane Marple receives an enigmatic invitation to the remote village of Hollowmere, she finds herself drawn into a puzzle where a knock at midnight stirs echoes of a forgotten past. With her knitting needles and keen insight, Miss Marple must untangle a web of secrets among the manor's residents, where every smile hides a shadow and every clue leads to a truth that refuses to stay silent. Chapter 1. The Quiet of St. Mary Mead. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the thatched cottages and bathing the village green in a warm, drowsy light. In her modest sitting room, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The room was a picture of order. A polished mahogany table held a vase of freshly cut roses, a tray of tea things stood at the ready, and the faint ticking of the mantel clock kept time with her thoughts. To an outsider, it was a scene of perfect tranquility, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes, peering over her spectacles, were never truly at rest. She had just finished a row of stitches when a knock at the door broke the silence. It was a gentle knock, polite but insistent, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside with a faint smile. "Now, who could that be, at this hour?" she murmured, rising with the grace of someone who knew the value of unhurried movements. The visitor was young Tommy Pierce, the postman's sitz boy, his cap slightly askew and a single letter clutched in his hand. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap. "This came for you. Looks important, fancy paper, and all." "Thank you, Tommy," Miss Marple replied, taking the envelope. It was indeed fine paper, cream-coloured with a subtle embossed border, and addressed in a precise, elegant hand she did not recognise. "Run along now, and don't sit let Mrs. Price Sitters Tabby steal your sandwiches again." Tommy grinned, his cheeks reddening. "I'll keep an eye out, miss." He scampered off, leaving Miss Marple to study the letter with growing curiosity. Back in her armchair, she slit the envelope with a silver letter opener and unfolded the contents. The letter was brief but intriguing, written in ink that gleamed like polished obsidian. "Dear Miss Marple, your reputation for discernment precedes you, even in a place as remote as Hollowmere. I write to request your presence at Hollowmere Manor for a matter of some delicacy. A peculiar occurrence has unsettled the household, and I believe your insight might bring clarity where confusion reigns. Enclosed is a train ticket for tomorrow's 10:15 to Hollowmere Station. Lodging and all comforts will be provided. I trust you will not find this request too forward. Yours sincerely, Eleanor Grayson." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly as she read the name, Eleanor Grayson. It rang no bells, yet the tone of the letter suggested a woman of refinement, perhaps one accustomed to command. The mention of a peculiar occurrence was tantalizingly vague, and Miss Marple's mind, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human nature, began to weave possibilities. A dispute over an inheritance, a scandal threatening to surface, or something altogether stranger. She set the letter down and picked up her knitting, her fingers moving automatically as her thoughts wandered. St. Mary Mead had been quiet of late. Too quiet, perhaps. The usual village intrigues, Mrs. Bantry's lost brooch, the vicar's feud with the organist had grown predictable, and Miss Marple found herself craving a puzzle worthy of her attention. This letter, with its air of understated urgency, promised just that. The next morning, Miss Marple rose early, her small suitcase packed with practical efficiency, a few dresses, her best shawl, and of course her knitting. She wore a neat tweed suit and a hat adorned with a single violet feather, a touch of whimsy that belied her formidable mind. At the station, she boarded the 10:15 train to Hollowmere, a journey of some 3 hours through rolling countryside. The carriage was nearly empty, save for a young man reading a newspaper and a woman with a restless toddler. Miss Marple settled by the window, her eyes tracing the patchwork of fields and hedgerows as she considered the task ahead. Hollowmere, she recalled, was a village even smaller than St. Mary Mead, nestled in a valley where the hills seemed to guard their secrets closely. She had passed through it once years ago, and remembered a quaint church, a crumbling manor, and whispers of an old tragedy, a disappearance perhaps, though the details eluded her. Her memory, sharp as it was, sometimes required a nudge, and she trusted Hollowmere itself would provide it. As the train rattled on, she opened her handbag and retrieved the letter, rereading it for clues. The phrase, peculiar occurrence, lingered in her mind. In her experience, such euphemisms often masked something far more troubling, a theft, a betrayal, or worse. She tucked the letter away and turned her attention to the passing scenery, noting the way the clouds cast fleeting shadows over the hills. People are much like clouds, she mused. They seem simple enough until you notice how they shift. The train arrived at Hollowmere Station just past 1 o'clock. The platform was deserted, save for a porter dozing on a bench and a black car idling nearby. A man in a chauffeur's cap approached her, his face weathered but kind. "Miss Marple, I'm Harold, sent by Mrs. Grayson to fetch you to the manor." "Thank you, Harold," she said, offering a polite smile. "Is it far?" "Not far, miss. 10 minutes by car, though the roads are a bit winding." He took her suitcase and led her to the car, holding the door open with a deference that spoke of old-fashioned manners. The drive to Hollowmere Manor was indeed winding, the narrow lanes flanked by ancient oaks and stone walls overgrown with ivy. Miss Marple observed the landscape with interest, noting the isolation of the place. No wonder the village felt forgotten. It was as if time itself had paused here. The manor came into view at the crest of a hill, a sprawling stone building with tall windows and a slate roof weathered by decades of rain. Ivy clung to its walls, giving it an air of both grandeur and neglect. As the car pulled up to the entrance, a woman emerged from the heavy oak doors. She was tall, with silver hair swept into a chignon, and her eyes held a mix of warmth and wariness. "Miss Marple," she said, extending a gloved hand, "I stem Eleanor Grayson. Thank you for coming on such short notice." "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Grayson," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but her gaze keen. "Your letter suggested a matter of some urgency." Eleanor's smile faltered just for a moment. "Indeed. Shall we go inside? The others are waiting, and I'm sure you still want to settle in before we discuss the matter." Miss Marple nodded, sensing the weight behind Eleanor's words. As they stepped into the manor's dimly lit hall, the air grew cooler, carrying the scent of old wood and wax polish. A grand staircase spiraled upward, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed, its echo lingering a fraction too long. Miss Marple's instinct stirred. Hollowmere Manor was no ordinary house, and its secrets were already whispering to her. What a curious beginning to our tale, don't you think? Miss Marple is stepping into a mystery that promises to twist and turn like the lanes of Hollowmere. Where are you listening this story from? perhaps a cozy village like St. Mary Mead or somewhere far more mysterious? Share your location in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more mysteries. The manor's secrets are only just beginning to unravel, and you won't want to miss a single clue. Chapter 2: The Invitation to Hollowmere. The entrance hall of Hollowmere Manor seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple followed Eleanor Grayson inside. The air was cool, tinged with the musty scent of old books and beeswax, and the high ceiling disappeared into shadows where the afternoon light couldn't reach. A chandelier hung above, its crystals dulled by dust, and the parquet floor creaked softly underfoot. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in every detail: the faded tapestries, the heavy drapes drawn half-closed, and the faint scratches near the base of the oak door, as if someone or something had once tried to claw their way in. Eleanor led her through a set of double doors into a drawing room that was both grand and faintly forlorn. The furniture was elegant but worn, with velvet cushions fraying at the edges and a fireplace that looked as though it hadn't been lit in years. A large bay window overlooked a garden choked with overgrown roses, their thorns pressing against the glass like silent sentinels. Seated around the room were the manor's residents, their faces turning toward Miss Marple with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Everyone," Eleanor announced, her voice clear but carrying a slight tremor. "This is Miss Jane Marple, from St. Mary Mead. She said kindly agreed to join us for a few days." Miss Marple smiled politely, her hands clasped over her handbag, and nodded to the group. "How do you do?" she said, her tone warm but measured. She took a seat in a high-backed chair near the window, her posture straight but unassuming, and let her gaze wander over the assembled company. In her experience, first impressions were like the first stitches in a piece of knitting, seemingly simple but critical to the pattern that would emerge. Eleanor gestured to a man standing by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. He was in his late 50s, with a lean frame, a neatly trimmed mustache, and eyes that darted about as if expecting trouble. "This is my brother-in-law, Colonel Rupert Grayson," Eleanor said. "He manages the estate's affairs." "Delighted, Miss Marple," Colonel Grayson said, though his stiff nod suggested otherwise. "I trust you had a pleasant journey? Hollowmere sits a bit out of the way. I'm afraid." "Quite pleasant, thank you," Miss Marple replied. "The countryside here is charming, though I imagine it keeps its secrets as well as any city." The Colonel's mustache twitched, but he said nothing, turning instead to adjust a photograph on the mantel, a family portrait, Miss Marple noted, with a young woman conspicuously absent from the current gathering. Next, Eleanor introduced a woman seated on a settee, her fingers nervously twisting a lace handkerchief. She was perhaps 40, with delicate features and hair pinned up in a style that was a decade out of date. "This is Mrs. Clara Beaumont, my cousin," Eleanor said. "She's been staying with us since, well, for some time now." Clara Stutt's eyes flickered to Miss Marple, then dropped to her lap. "A pleasure," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I hope you still find Hollowmere welcoming." "I'm sure I shall," Miss Marple said kindly, noting the woman's pallor and the way her hands trembled. Fear, she thought, or guilt, or perhaps both. A younger man lounged in an armchair by the fire, one leg crossed carelessly over the other. He was handsome in a careless sort of way, with dark hair that fell over his forehead and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "And this," Eleanor said, her tone cooling slightly, "is Mr. Lionel Trent, a family friend." Lionel rose, offering a theatrical bow. "Charmed, Miss Marple. I hear you sit something of a sleuth, come to unravel our little mysteries, have you? Miss Marple's smile remained serene. I am merely a guest, Mr. Trent. Though I do find people's stories endlessly fascinating. Lionel's grin widened, but there was a sharpness to it, like a blade hidden in silk. Oh, we've got stories here. All right, stick around, and you might hear a few. The final introduction was to a young woman perched on a stool near the piano, her fingers idly tracing the keys without playing. She was striking, with auburn hair and a defiant tilt to her chin, though her eyes held a guarded quality. My niece, Miss Sylvia Grayson, Eleanor said. She's home from university for the summer. Sylvia gave a curt nod. Hello, she said. Her voice clipped. I hope you like old houses, Miss Marple. This one's got more creaks than charm. Sylvia, please, Eleanor said softly, but her reproof lacked conviction. Sylvia shrugged and turned back to the piano, striking a single discordant note that lingered in the air. Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her hands resting lightly on her handbag. The room was a tableau of unease, each person a thread in a tapestry she had yet to unravel. Eleanor's graciousness felt practiced, the Colonel's stiffness hinted at hidden burdens, Clara's nervousness suggested a secret she couldn't bear to keep, Lionel's charm was too polished to be genuine, and Sylvia's defiance masked something deeper, grief perhaps or resentment. Eleanor cleared her throat, breaking the silence. Miss Marple, you must be tired after your journey. Would you like to see your room before tea? That would be lovely, Miss Marple said, rising. Though I'm curious. What prompted your kind invitation? Your letter mentioned a peculiar occurrence. Sipter. The room stilled. Clutter's handkerchief twisted tighter, Lionel's smile faltered, and Sylvia's fingers froze on the piano keys. The Colonel coughed, glancing at Eleanor, who hesitated before speaking. It's sutter, small matter, Eleanor said, her voice carefully even. A disturbance, really. Nothing to trouble you with just yet. Why discuss it after you settled. Of course, Miss Marple said, her tone mild but her eyes sharp. She followed Eleanor out of the drawing-room, noting the way the others exchanged glances, furtive, waited, as if each feared what the others might say. Upstairs, Eleanor led her to a guest room overlooking the garden. It was comfortably furnished, with a 4-poster bed, a writing desk, and a window that rattled faintly in the breeze. I hope you'll be comfortable here, Eleanor said, lingering in the doorway. Dinner is at 7. The others will join us, and, well, perhaps we'll speak more then. Thank you, Mrs. Grayson, Miss Marple said. I look forward to it. When Eleanor had gone, Miss Marple unpacked her suitcase, placing her knitting on the bedside table. She crossed to the window and looked out at the garden, where a gardener in a worn cap was pruning the roses with meticulous care. His movements were slow, almost ritualistic, and Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with him later. Gardeners, she knew, often saw more than they let on. She sat at the desk and opened her notebook, a small leather-bound volume she kept for such occasions. And with a pencil, she jotted down the names of the manor's residents, along with her first impressions: Eleanor, gracious but anxious; Colonel Grayson, guarded, perhaps ashamed; Clara, frightened, hiding something; Lionel, too charming, untrustworthy; Sylvia, angry, possibly grieving. Beneath these, she wrote a single word: knock. The word stared back at her. A question mark, as much as a clue. Whatever this peculiar occurrence was, it had unsettled the household enough to summon a stranger from St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple closed the notebook and smiled faintly. "People are so very predictable," she murmured, "and yet so very surprising." She glanced at the clock. There was time before dinner to explore the manor's grounds, perhaps to observe the residents from a distance. Human nature, she had learned, revealed itself most clearly when people thought no one was watching. Chapter 3. The Knock at Midnight. The dining room of Hollowmere Manor was a study in faded opulence, its long mahogany table gleaming under the soft glow of a chandelier that flickered as if unsure of its own light. Miss Marple sat near the head of the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes quietly taking in the scene. The meal was simple but well prepared: roast lamb, buttered potatoes, and a medley of vegetables from the manor's garden, but the atmosphere was anything but relaxed. The clink of cutlery and the murmur of polite conversation did little to mask the undercurrent of tension that rippled through the room. Eleanor Grayson presided over the table with the poise of a seasoned hostess, though her smile seemed to strain at the edges. Colonel Grayson sat opposite her, carving the lamb with military precision, his jaw tight as he avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Clara Beaumont picked at her food, her fork trembling slightly, while Lionel Trent leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of red wine with an air of amused detachment. Sylvia Grayson, seated beside Miss Marple, ate in silence, her auburn hair catching the candlelight as she cast occasional glances toward the window. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the small details, the way Eleanor's fingers tightened around her napkin when Lionel made a jest, the faint flush on Clara's cheeks when the Colonel mentioned the estate's finances, and the way Sylvia's fork paused whenever the conversation turned to the manor's history. It was, she thought, like watching a play where the actors knew their lines but not their motives. "Miss Marple," Lionel said, breaking a lull in the conversation, "you must tell us about St. Mary Mead. Is it as quaint as they say, or do you have your share of scandals too?" "Oh, St. Mary Mead is quite ordinary," Miss Marple replied, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "Though I find that even the smallest villages have their secrets. People are much the same everywhere. Don't set you think." Lionel's smile was all teeth. "Some are better at keeping secrets than others, I stout wager." "Lionel, please," Eleanor said, her voice soft but edged with warning. "Let's not bore Miss Marple with our little dramas." "No drama here," Lionel said, raising his glass. "Just making conversation. Unless, of course, there sits something you rather not discuss." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Clara's fork clattered against her plate, and she murmured an apology, her face paling. Sylvia's eyes flicked to her aunt, then back to her plate, her lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple sipped her water, her expression serene. "I find," she said, "that conversation often reveals more than it intends. But do go on, Mr. Trent. I am all ears." Before Lionel could reply, a sharp, deliberate sound cut through the room, a knock, loud and unmistakable, echoing from the direction of the front hall. It was not a tentative tap, but a firm, insistent rapping, as if someone demanded entry with no intention of being ignored. Eleanor froze, her napkin slipping to the floor. The Colonel's knife paused mid-slice, and Clara let out a small gasp. Lionel's grin vanished, replaced by a look of wary curiosity, while Sylvia's chair scraped as she half rose, her eyes fixed on the door. "Good heavens," Miss Marple said mildly, setting down her glass. "Who could be calling at this hour?" Eleanor recovered first, rising with a forced smile. "It's Stu's probably just Harold, checking the doors. Stu's very thorough, our chauffeur. Stu see to it." "I'll come with you," Sylvia said quickly, her voice sharp. She stood, brushing past her aunt and striding toward the hall. Miss Marple watched them go, noting the way the others exchanged glances. Clara sipped wide-eyed fear, the Colonel sipped clenched jaw, Lionel sipped feigned nonchalance. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "Perhaps I still stretch my legs," she said. "A little air might do me good." She followed Eleanor and Sylvia into the hall, where the heavy oak door stood closed, its brass knocker gleaming faintly in the dim light. Eleanor hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle, then pulled the door open with a creak. The porch was empty, the night beyond dark and still, save for the rustle of leaves in the wind. "No one," Sylvia said, her voice a mix of relief and frustration. She stepped onto the porch, peering into the shadows. "Not a soul." "How curious," Miss Marple said, joining them. She glanced at the ground, noting the absence of footprints in the gravel. "A knock like that suggests purpose, yet there sits no one to claim it." Eleanor's face was pale, her hands clasped tightly. "It's happened before," she admitted, her voice low. "Not often, but enough to unsettle us." "Before?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but her eyes were keen. "How often, Mrs. Grayson?" Eleanor hesitated, glancing at Sylvia, who looked away. "A few times this month. Always at night, always 3 knocks, and always no one there." "Perhaps it's the wind," Miss Marple suggested, though her expression suggested she thought no such thing. "Or a branch against the door." "There is no branch close enough," Sylvia said curtly, "and the wind doesn't knock like that." They returned to the dining room, where the others waited, in uneasy silence. The Colonel cleared his throat. "Just a prank, no doubt," he said gruffly. "Village boys, playing tricks." At midnight, Clara Stepp's voice was barely a whisper. In Hollowmere, there steps hardly anyone about. Lionel leaned forward, his eyes glinting. "Maybe it starts not a person at all. Old houses have their ghosts, don't start they." "Don't be ridiculous," Sylvia snapped, but her hands were clenched at her sides. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her mind already turning over the possibilities. A knock with no source was intriguing, but not unprecedented. In St. Mary Mead, she'd once solved a case involving a ghostly bell that turned out to be a signal for a smuggler's rendezvous, but this felt different, more personal, more deliberate. She glanced at the faces around the table, each one a mask hiding its own truth. "Perhaps," she said, her voice calm, "we might consider who benefits from such a disturbance. Fear, after all, is a powerful motivator." The Colonel coughed, Clara looked down, and Lionel's smile returned, though it was less certain now. Eleanor rang for the maid to clear the plates, her movements brisk as if to dispel the unease. "Let's have dessert," she said. "No need to dwell on nonsense." But as the meal continued, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the knock. 3 sharp raps, precise and purposeful, yet no one at the door. It was, she decided, a message of what and to whom remained to be seen. She made a mental note to examine the porch in daylight, to check for signs of tampering or tricks, and she would watch the residents closely, for their reactions had told her more than their words. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple retired to her room, her notebook open on the desk. She added to her earlier notes, knock at midnight, 3 raps, no source, Eleanor anxious, Sylvia defensive, Clara terrified, Lionel intrigued, Colonel dismissive. A pattern perhaps, but not yet clear. She paused, then wrote, motive, fear, distraction, or warning. She closed the notebook and glanced at the window, where the night pressed against the glass. Hollowmere Manor was alive with secrets, and the knock was only the beginning. Tomorrow she would begin to unravel them, one thread at a time. Chapter 4. Whispers of the Past. The morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Hollowmere Manor, casting long shadows across the breakfast room, where Miss Marple sat with a cup of tea and a plate of toast. The room was quieter than the dining room had been the previous night, with only Eleanor Grayson and Clara Beaumont present. The Colonel was out inspecting the estate. Sylvia had yet to appear, and Lionel, Eleanor had mentioned with a faint frown, was not an early riser. The silence was broken only by the clink of porcelain and the distant song of a thrush outside. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes resting on the garden beyond the window. The roses, though overgrown, were in full bloom, their petals a vivid contrast to the manor's sombre stone walls. She had risen early, as was her habit, and taken a brief walk around the porch before breakfast. The gravel showed no fresh footprints, and the oak door's knocker was heavy but unremarkable, with no signs of tampering. The knock at midnight remained a puzzle, but Miss Marple was content to let it simmer in her mind, like a pot left to steep. "Mrs. Grayson," she said, breaking the quiet, "this manor is quite striking. How long has it been in your family?" Eleanor looked up from her plate, her expression softening. "Oh, generations. The Graysons have lived here since the early 1800s. It sits a beautiful old place, but," she hesitated, her fingers tightening around her teacup, "it sits seen its share of troubles." "Old houses often do," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but encouraging. "They carry their history in every creak and corner." Clara glanced up, her eyes darting nervously between Eleanor and Miss Marple. "Some histories are best left alone," she murmured, then quickly returned to her toast, as if regretting the words. Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her mind was alert. "I find that history has a way of making itself heard, Mrs. Beaumont, like a knock in the night, perhaps." Eleanor Sitt's teacup clattered against its saucer, and she set it down with care. "You, Sue, referring to last night," she said, her voice low. "I suppose there sits no avoiding it. The knock, it sits not the first time, as I mentioned. It sits become something of a local legend. I sit am afraid." "A legend?" Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with interest. "Do tell. I stum quite fond of village stories." Eleanor sighed, folding her hands in her lap. "It began about 20 years ago. Or, so I'm told. I wasn't here then. Rupert and I were abroad, you see, with his regiment. But the story goes that a young woman, Margaret Grayson, vanished from the manor one night. She was Rupert's cousin, a quiet girl, barely 20. The family was distraught, naturally. They searched for weeks, but no trace of her was ever found." "How dreadful," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "And the knock." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "The night she disappeared, there was a knock at the door, 3 sharp raps, just like last night. No one was there when they opened it. Since then, it's happened now and again, always at night, always 3 knocks. Some say it's Margaret's spirit, trying to come home." Clara made a small, choked sound, her hand flying to her mouth. "Eleanor, please, it's nonsense, just a story." Is it? Eleanor's tone was sharp, though her eyes softened as she looked at Clara. You heard it yourself, Clara. You know it's not just a story. Miss Marple set her teacup down, her expression thoughtful. A disappearance is a heavy burden for a house to carry. Were there any theories at the time about what happened to Margaret? Eleanor hesitated, glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone to interrupt. The police thought she might have run away. There was talk of a suitor, someone the family didn't approve of. Others said she might have met with an accident. The woods around Hollowmere are dense, and there's a river not far off, but no one really knows. And the family? Miss Marple asked. What did they believe? Rupert's father was convinced she's been taken, Eleanor said. He spent years hiring detectives, chasing rumors. It nearly bankrupted the estate. Rupert doesn't like to talk about it. It's a sore subject, you understand. Of course, Miss Marple said, her voice sympathetic but her mind racing. A disappearance, a knock, and a family still haunted by both. It was, she thought, like a piece of knitting with a dropped stitch. Pull at the right thread, and the whole pattern might unravel. Before she could press further, Sylvia entered the room, her auburn hair slightly dishevelled and her expression stormy. Morning, she said curtly, dropping into a chair and reaching for the teapot. What are we talking about? The weather, or something equally thrilling? Eleanor Stead's smile was strained. Miss Marple was asking about the Manor Stead's history. Sylvia's eyes flicked to Miss Marple, sharp and assessing. History. This place is practically drowning in it. Every room got a ghost story, if you believe the servants. Do you believe them, Miss Grayson? Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. Sylvia snorted, pouring her tea. I believe in what I can see. Ghosts don't knock on doors, they too busy rattling chains, aren't they? Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering, though I find that the living are often more mysterious than the dead. Sylvia's hand paused, the teapot hovering mid-air. You're an odd one, Miss Marple, she said, but there was a flicker of respect in her gaze before she looked away. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, the state of the garden, the upcoming village fete, but Miss Marple's thoughts remained on Margaret Grayson. After breakfast, she excused herself to explore the manor's grounds, determined to gather more pieces of the puzzle. She wandered toward the garden, where the gardener she'd seen the previous day was still at work, his shears snipping methodically at the roses. Good morning, she called, approaching with her usual unassuming air. You a fine hand with these roses. They sit quite splendid, despite the neglect. The gardener, an older man with weathered skin and eyes like chipped flint, straightened slowly. Thank you, Mastem, he said, his voice gruff, but not unkind. They been here longer than I have. Tough things, roses, survive most anything. I Miss Marple, she said, offering a smile. You must know the manor well, working here as you do. 40 years, he said, wiping his hands on his apron. Name Amos. Seen a lot I have. I imagine so, Miss Marple said, her tone conversational but her eyes keen. Mrs. Grayson mentioned a young woman who vanished years ago. Margaret, I believe. Were you here then? Amos's hands stilled, and he looked at her, his expression guarded. I was here. Bad business that. Poor Miss Margaret. Never should happened. Did you know her well? Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle. Well enough, Amos said, turning back to his roses. She was kind, always stopping to chat. Loved the garden. She did. Used to sit by that old oak over there, reading her books. Miss Marple followed his gaze to a gnarled tree at the garden sip's edge, its branches heavy with age. Did she seem troubled before she disappeared? Amos hesitated, his shears snipping a thorn with unnecessary force. She was distracted, near the end, kept to herself. Heard her arguing with someone once, late at night, by the gate. Couldn't tell who, though. Arguing? Miss Marple's sixth tone was curious, but not pressing. That must have been unusual for her. Amos said. She wasn't one for fights. But that night, he shook his head. Next day, she was gone. And then, the knock started. The knock, Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft. You heard it too. More times than I care to count, Amos said, his eyes distant. Always at night, always 3. Never seen who does it. Makes your skin crawl. It does. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the information. Thank you, Amos. You been most helpful. She left him to his work, her thoughts turning over the new threads. Margaret's disappearance and argument, the knock that began in its wake. Back in her room, she opened her notebook and added to her notes, Margaret Grayson, vanished 20 years ago, possible suitor, argument overheard. Knock began after, Thomas reliable witness. Something left unsaid. She underlined the word argument, her pencil lingering on the page. The manor was a maze of secrets, and the knock was its heartbeat. Miss Marple closed her notebook and glanced at the window where the oak tree stood like a silent witness. She would need to learn more about Margaret and about who might have wanted her gone. Chapter 5. The Dinner Party. The dining room of Hollowmere Manor was alight with candles that evening, their flames casting a warm but flickering glow across the polished table. Miss Marple sat near the centre, her posture as unassuming as ever, her eyes quietly observing the interplay of light and shadow on the faces around her. The table was set with fine china and silver, a nod to the manor's grand past, but the atmosphere was far from festive. The air held a tautness, like a thread stretched to its breaking point, and Miss Marple sensed that the knock from the previous night had left its mark on the household. Eleanor Grayson, at the head of the table, presided with her usual grace, though her smiles were fleeting and her hands fidgeted with the stem of her wineglass. Colonel Grayson sat to her right, his face stern as he sliced into his beef Wellington with unnecessary force. Clara Beaumont, opposite Miss Marple, seemed smaller tonight, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for a storm. Lyle Trent lounged to Miss Marple's left, his charm dialed to a provocative edge, while Sylvia Grayson, at the far end, toyed with her food, her expression a mix of boredom and defiance. A new face joined them, Mr. Henry Poole, the local vicar, a portly man with thinning hair and a nervous laugh that punctuated his sentences like an ill-timed drumbeat. Miss Marple, Eleanor said, passing a dish of roasted vegetables, I do hope you are settling in. Hollowmere must seem terribly quiet after St. Mary Mead. Oh, I find quiet places often have the loudest secrets, Miss Marple replied, her tone light, but her gaze steady. This manor, for instance, seems to hum with stories. Lionel chuckled, raising his glass. Well said, Miss Marple. This old pile sit's got more tales than a Gothic novel. Care to share one, Eleanor? Perhaps the one about our ghostly knocker. Eleanor sits, smile tightened. Lionel, must you? It sits, hardly dinner conversation. Why not? Sylvia interjected, her voice sharp as she leaned forward. Everyone sits thinking about it. That knock last night wasn't sits the wind, and we all know it." "Sylvia, please," Clara murmured, her fork trembling in her hand. It sets unsettling. That sets all. Unsettling." Sylvia's laugh was brittle. "It sits more than that, Clara. It sits like this house is trying to tell us something, and we sit all too stubborn to listen." The Colonel cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "Nonsense. It sits a prank. Nothing more. Some village lad with too much time on his hands." "Then why sits it been happening for 20 years?" Sylvia shot back, her eyes flashing. "Ever since." "Sylvia." Eleanor Six's voice cut through, sharp and commanding. "That's six enough." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth. Mr. Poole, the vicar, coughed nervously, his fingers drumming on the table. Now, he said, his laugh high and strained. "Let's not dwell on old tales. The Lord's peace is with us after all. Perhaps a prayer before dessert." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression serene. "I find, Mr. Poole, that old tales often have a kernel of truth. Or, this knock, for instance, Mrs. Grayson mentioned, it began with a young woman's disappearance. Margaret, was it?" The name landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the room. Clara's fork clattered to her plate, and she flushed, murmuring an apology. The Colonel's jaw tightened, his knife pausing mid-cut. Lionel's eyes glinted with interest, while Sylvia leaned back, her arms crossed, watching the others with a look that was almost triumphant. Eleanor set down her glass, her voice carefully measured. "Yes, Margaret Grayson. It was a tragedy, Miss Marple, but it sits long past. I am not sure what it has to do with recent events." "Perhaps nothing," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, "but I found that the past has a way of knocking on the present sept's door, so to speak." Mr. Poole laughed again, the sound jarring in the tense silence. "Oh, very clever, Miss Marple. Very clever indeed, but surely it's just a coincidence. Old houses creak, doors knock. Ha ha. Do they?" Miss Marple's smile was polite, but her eyes lingered on the vicar, noting the sweat beading on his brow despite the cool room. "In my experience, Mr. Poole, coincidences are often clues in disguise." Lionel leaned forward, his voice low and teasing. "Careful, vicar. Miss Marple's got a nose for secrets. You wouldn't want her sniffing around your vestry, would you?" The vicar's laugh faltered, and he reached for his water glass, his hand unsteady. "Oh, I nothing to hide, Mr. Trent. Just a humble servant of the church. Ha ha." Miss Marple sipped her wine, her mind cataloguing the reactions. The mention of Margaret had struck a nerve, and the knock was clearly more than a prank to this household. She turned to Sylvia, whose defiance seemed to mask a deeper emotion. "Miss Grayson," she said, "you seem convinced the knock means something. Have you a theory?" Sylvia hesitated, her eyes flicking to Eleanor before answering. "Think someone's trying to scare us, or remind us. Margaret's story never added up. She didn't just run off. And that knock, it like a warning." "A warning of what?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but probing. Sylvia's lips parted, but before she could speak, a low, deliberate knock echoed through the manor, 3 sharp raps, unmistakable, coming from the front hall. The sound was louder than the previous night, as if daring the room to ignore it. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her chest. The Colonel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Blast it," he muttered, striding toward the hall. "I still put an end to this nonsense." Lion rose, his grin returning. "I'm coming too. Can miss the ghost hunt." Sylvia followed, her face pale but determined, and Eleanor hesitated before joining them. Miss Marple rose as well, her movements unhurried, and glanced at Clara, who remained seated, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay here, Mrs. Beaumont," she said kindly. "We see what." In the hall, the Colonel flung open the oak door, revealing the same empty porch as the night before. The gravel path was undisturbed, the night air still and cold. Sylvia stepped outside, her breath visible in the chill. "Nothing," she said, her voice tight. Again. The Colonel slammed the door shut, his face red with frustration. "This is intolerable," he growled. "If I catch whoever sits behind this, perhaps it stutters not a few who spat at all," Lionel said, his tone mocking. "Maybe Margaret Sit's ghost is getting restless." "Enough, Lionel," Eleanor snapped, her composure fraying. "This isn't set a game." Miss Marple stood quietly, her eyes scanning the hall. The knocker was heavy brass, too solid to move on its own, and the door showed no signs of being forced. She noted the way the sound had carried, clear and deliberate, as if meant to be heard by all. "Curious," she murmured, almost to herself. "It's as if the knock wants an audience." Back in the dining room, Clara was trembling, her hands clasped tightly. Mr. Poole hovered near her, muttering reassurances that sounded hollow. "It's nothing, Mrs. Beaumont," he said. "Just the wind, perhaps." "Ha, ha." Miss Marple resumed her seat, her mind turning over the evening's events. The knock had come at a moment of heightened tension, as if timed to disrupt. She glanced at the faces around the table. Eleanor's strained calm, the Colonel's barely contained anger, Clara's fear, Lionel's amusement, Sylvia's defiance, and the vicar's nervous chatter. Each reaction was a thread, and Miss Marple was beginning to see the shape of the pattern. As dessert was served, a lemon tart that no one seemed eager to eat, she opened her notebook later that night in her room, adding to her observations. Second knock, same pattern, 3 raps, no source. Timing suggests intent. Sylvia believes it's a warning. Clara terrified, Lionel goading, Colonel defensive, Eleanor hiding something, Vicar overly nervous, possibly involved. Margaret's name unsettles all. She paused, then wrote knock as distraction, or signal. She closed the notebook and glanced at the window, where the moon cast a pale light over the garden. The manor was a house of echoes, and the knock was its loudest voice yet. Tomorrow she would seek out more threads, perhaps in the library, where old houses often kept their secrets. Chapter 6. Shadows in the Library. The morning after the dinner party dawned grey and heavy, with clouds hanging low over Hollowmere Manor like a shroud. Miss Marple, undeterred by the gloom, decided to spend her morning in the manor's library, a room Eleanor had mentioned in passing as a place of quiet retreat. Libraries, in Miss Marple's experience, were treasure troves of secrets. Books held not only words, but the traces of those who had turned their pages. She dressed in her usual tweed, her violet feathered hat left on the bedside table, and made her way downstairs, her steps light but purposeful. The library was at the end of a long corridor, its double doors carved with intricate vines that seemed to writhe in the dim light. Inside, the room was a cavern of oak shelves, their surfaces crowded with leather-bound volumes and dusty tomes. A high window let in a sliver of grey light, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. The air smelled of old paper and wax, with a faint undercurrent of mildew. A large desk stood in one corner, cluttered with papers and an inkstand, while a pair of armchairs flanked a cold fireplace. Miss Marple closed the door behind her, the click echoing softly, and began her exploration. She moved slowly along the shelves, her fingers trailing lightly over the spines. There were novels, histories, and treatises on botany, but her eyes were drawn to a section of local records, ledgers, parish registers, and family chronicles. "Every house has its memory," she murmured, pulling a slim volume titled Hollowmere, a history, from the shelf. It was a dry account of the village's founding, but a folded letter slipped from its pages, yellowed and brittle with age. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the faded ink. It was dated 20 years ago, addressed to "My dearest M." The handwriting was elegant but hurried, and the words carried a note of urgency. "My heart, I beg you to reconsider. Meet me tonight by the oak at midnight. If you cannot come, leave a sign. I will wait, but we have little time. Yours, always, E." The letter was unsigned, save for the initial, and Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. E could be anyone. Eleanor, perhaps, or another unknown figure. And Margaret. She tucked the letter into her handbag, intending to examine it further, and continued her search. As she reached for another book, her fingers brushed against a panel behind the shelf that felt oddly loose. Curious, she pressed gently, and with a soft click, a small compartment swung open, revealing a hidden recess. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn but intact, with the initials MG embossed in gold. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her expression remained serene. She carried the journal to the desk, settling into the chair and opening it with care. The journal belonged to Margaret Grayson, its entries spanning the months before her disappearance. And the handwriting was neat, almost fastidious, but the tone grew increasingly anxious as the pages progressed. Miss Marple read carefully, her eyes lingering on key passages. June 12, 1905. The manor feels heavier each day, as if the walls are listening. Father disapproves of E, but he doesn't understand. I cannot stop my heart, though I fear where it leads. July 3rd, 1905. Another argument tonight. I heard voices in the hall. Someone knows, but who? I must be careful, but I cannot bear this secrecy much longer. July 15th, 1905. 3 knocks at midnight, but no one there. I looked out my window and saw a shadow by the oak, but it vanished. Is it a warning? I cannot tell yet. I must be sure. The final entry, dated July 20th, was incomplete, the ink smudged as if written in haste. Tonight I will go to the oak. If all goes well, we shall be free. If not, I pray no one finds this. Miss Marple closed the journal, her mind racing. Margaret had been planning to meet someone, likely the E from the letter, at the oak tree, the same tree Amos had mentioned. The knock, even then, had been a signal, perhaps, or a threat. She slipped the journal into her handbag, intending to keep it safe until she could piece together its meaning. As she rose, the library door creaked open, and Sylvia Grayson stepped inside, her auburn hair catching the faint light. She froze, her eyes narrowing, as they met Miss Marple's. "Oh," she said, her tone guarded. "I didn't expect anyone here. Good morning, Miss Grayson." Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I was just admiring the library. It sets quite a collection." Sylvia Sitt's gaze flicked to the desk, where the hidden compartment was now closed. "It sits mostly old junk," she said, moving to a shelf and pulling out a novel with forced nonchalance. "Aunt Eleanor likes to pretend we sit still a grand family, but it sits all dust and memories." "Memories can be powerful," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "especially in a place like this with so much history. I understand a young woman, Margaret, once lived here. Did you know her?" Sylvia Sitt's hand tightened on the book, her knuckles whitening. "I was a baby when she disappeared. I only know what people say, that she ran off with some man, or drowned in the river, or worse." Her voice wavered, but she quickly steadied it. "Why do you care? It sets ancient history." "History has a way of lingering," Miss Marple said, "like a knock that one sit stop." Sylvia Sitt's eyes flashed, but before she could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor, and Lionel Trent appeared in the doorway, his grin as sharp as ever. "Well, well," he said, leaning against the frame. "A secret meeting in the library? Should I be jealous, Miss Marple?" "Not at all, Mr. Trent," Miss Marple replied, her tone unruffled. "I was merely indulging my love of books. And you? What brings you here?" "Oh, I stum always poking around," Lionel said, his eyes scanning the room. "Old houses like this are full of surprises. Find anything interesting?" Miss Marple Sitt's smile was serene, her handbag resting innocently in her lap. "Only the usual stories of the past, though I suspect this house has more to tell." Lionel Sitt's grin widened, but his eyes were calculating. "Careful, Miss Marple. Some stories don't set like being told." Sylvia snorted, slamming her book back onto the shelf. "You're both ridiculous," she said, brushing past Lionel and out the door. Miss Marple watched her go, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands clenched at her sides. Lionel lingered, his gaze lingering on the desk. "She sits a firecracker. Our Sylvia," he said. "Always has been. But you sit you're a bit of a mystery yourself, aren't you, Miss Marple?" "Hardly," she said, rising and smoothing her skirt. "I stop just an old woman with a fondness for puzzles." As she left the library, her handbag heavier with the weight of Margaret's journal, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery tightening. The knock, the letter, the journal, all pointed to a truth buried deep in the manor's past. She returned to her room and opened her notebook, adding to her observations, "Margaret's journal, meeting planned with E at Oak, knock as signal or threat. Sylvia defensive, possibly knows more. Lionel too curious, watching me." She underlined E, her pencil lingering on the page. The library had given her a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was far from complete. Tonight she would keep her ears open for another knock and her eyes on those who heard it. Chapter 7. The Gardener Set's Tale. The afternoon air in Hollowmere was crisp, with a breeze that carried the scent of damp earth and fading roses. Miss Marple, wrapped in her shawl, made her way to the garden, her steps slow but deliberate. The grey clouds from the morning had parted, allowing shafts of sunlight to pierce the canopy of ancient oaks, and the manor's grounds seemed almost peaceful, if not for the weight of secrets that clung to every leaf and stone. Her discovery of Margaret Grayson's journal had sharpened her focus, and she sought out Amos the gardener, whose earlier reticence suggested he knew more than he had let on. She found him near the old oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching like fingers toward the sky. Amos was raking leaves, his movements methodical, his weathered face set in a frown that deepened as he noticed her approach. He leaned on his rake, his eyes narrowing slightly, but he nodded in greeting. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff. "Back to admire the roses." "They sit lovely," Miss Marple replied, her smile warm, but her gaze steady. "Though I confess, I sit more curious about the tree today. You mentioned Margaret Grayson used to sit here, reading her books." Amos's hand tightened on the rake, and he glanced at the oak, his expression unreadable. "Aye, she did. Liked the shade," she said. "Quiet spot, away from the house." "It stops a fine spot," Miss Marple said, settling onto a nearby bench with her knitting in her lap. Her needles clicked softly, a soothing rhythm that often put others at ease. "I imagine you saw a great deal, working here all those years. Things others might miss." Amos grunted, resuming his raking. "See more than I say. That sits for sure. Gardeners Dundies get invited to the big house, but we hear things all the same." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes bright with interest. "I'm sure you do. Mrs. Grayson told me about Margaret Sip's disappearance, such a tragedy. And the knock that started soon after. You said it began the night she vanished. Did you hear it yourself?" Amos stopped raking, his shoulders stiffening. He looked toward the manor, as if ensuring they were alone, then lowered his voice. "I heard it all right. Never forget that night. It was late, past midnight. I was in my shed, fixing a broken spade, when it came 3 knocks, clear as a bell. Thought it was someone at the door, so I went to look. Nothing. Not a soul. Not a footprint. Just the dark." "How curious," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but probing. "And Margaret, was she seen after that?" Amos shook his head, his eyes distant. "That was the night she went missing. I saw her earlier, though, by this very tree. She was pacing, nervous-like, clutching a letter. Kept looking at the gate, like she was waiting for someone." "A letter?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, but her mind flashed to the folded note she found in the library, signed only with an E. "Did you see who she was waiting for?" "Didn't see no one," Amos said, his tone clipped. "But I heard voices later near the gate, her and someone else arguing. Couldn't make out the words, but she sounded scared. I meant to check on her, but by the time I got there, she was gone." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her expression serene but her thoughts racing. "That must have been distressing," she said. "Did you tell anyone about the argument?" "Told the police," Amos said, his voice bitter. "They didn't care much, said she run off with some fella. Case closed. But I knew Miss Margaret. She wasn't the running kind. Loved this place, loved her family, even if they didn't always see eye to eye." "You sound fond of her," Miss Marple said, her eyes kind but watchful. Amos's face softened, just for a moment. "She was a good lass, always kind to me. Brought me tea sometimes when I was working late. Did instead deserve what happened, whatever it was." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the details. An argument, a letter, a knock, and then silence. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though it was still incomplete. "Did the knock ever stop, after that night?" she asked. Amos shook his head. "Comes and goes, sometimes months without it. Then it starts again. Always 3 knocks. Always at night. Makes you think." He trailed off, his eyes fixed on the oak. "Think what?" Amos. Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper, inviting confidence. He hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice low. Makes you think she sits still out there, trying to get back, or someone sits making sure we don't sit forget her. Miss Marple sits needles paused again, her eyes meeting his. That sits an interesting thought, she said. Do you believe it sits a ghost? Amos? He snorted, but there was unease in his eyes. Dumb soft. Believe in ghosts, miss, but I believe in guilt, and this house is full of it. Nefter. Dumb soft. Is full of it. Before Miss Marple could press further, a figure appeared at the garden's edge, Clara Beaumont, her lace shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. She looked fragile in the sunlight, her face pale, and her eyes darting nervously. Amos, she called, her voice trembling. Mrs. Grayson needs you in the greenhouse. Something about the orchids. Amos nodded, picking up his rake. Right away, Mrs. Beaumont. He glanced at Miss Marple, his expression unreadable. Mind the oak, miss. It sets older than all of us, and it sets seen things. As he walked away, Clara lingered, her hands twisting in her shawl. Miss Marple, she said, her voice hesitant, I hope Amos wasn't set troubling you. He set in his ways. Not at all, Miss Marple said, her smile reassuring. He was telling me about the garden and about Margaret Grayson. You were here when she disappeared, weren't you? Clara's eyes widened, and she took a step back. Ah, yes, but I was young, just a guest here. It was so long ago. Her voice was almost a whisper, and she glanced toward the manor, as if afraid of being overheard. Of course, Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. It must have been a shock, though, such a mystery. Clara nodded, her hands trembling. It was awful. We all loved Margaret. She was so bright, so kind, and then just gone. She swallowed, her eyes filling with tears. Excuse me, I should go. She hurried away, her shawl trailing behind her like a ghost. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning over Amos's story and Clara's reaction, guilt. Amos had said, and Clara's fear suggested he might be right. She opened her notebook, adding to her observations. Amos saw Margaret with letter, heard argument, believes in guilt. Knock began, night of disappearance. Clara overly emotional, hiding something. She underlined letter, her pencil lingering on the page. The oak tree loomed behind her, its branches swaying in the breeze. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked into her handbag, and approached the tree, her eyes scanning its trunk. Near the base, half hidden by moss, were faint carvings, initials perhaps, though too weathered to read clearly. She thought, and beside it, another letter, possibly an E. She made a mental note to return with paper for a rubbing. The manor was a puzzle, and Amos's tale had added a new piece. The knock, the letter, the argument, all pointed to a truth buried in the past, but one that refused to stay silent. Miss Marple glanced at the house, its windows dark despite the sunlight. Tonight, she would listen for the knock again, and tomorrow she would seek out more answers, perhaps from the vicar, whose nervous laughter hinted at secrets of his own. Chapter 8. A pattern emerges. The late morning light filtered through the high windows of Hollowmere Manor, casting a soft glow across the parlour where Miss Marple sat with her knitting. The room was quieter today, the household subdued after the unsettling knock during the dinner party. Eleanor Grayson was attending to correspondence at a small desk, her pen scratching softly, while Clara Beaumont sat by the fire, her hands idle for once, her gaze fixed on the flames. The Colonel was out riding, Sylvia was nowhere to be seen, and Lionel, as usual, was late to rise. The stillness suited Miss Marple, who preferred to think in the spaces between conversations, where silences often spoke louder than words. Her mind was a tapestry of threads, each one a clue gathered over the past days. Margaret's journal, with its talk of a secret meeting and a mysterious Amos's tale of an argument and the knock that began the night she vanished, the letter hidden in the library, urging Margaret to meet at the Oak, and the reactions of the Manor's residents, each one layered with fear, guilt, or defiance. The knock itself was the central knot, tying the past to the present, and Miss Marple was beginning to see its shape. She set her knitting aside, and opened her notebook, reviewing her notes with a practiced eye. The knock was deliberate, always 3 raps, always at night, and always without a visible source. It had begun with Margaret's disappearance 20 years ago, and resurfaced now, unsettling the household. Why now? She wondered. What had changed to stir the past? Her pencil tapped lightly against the page as she considered the residents, Eleanor's strained composure, the Colonel's defensiveness, Clara's fear, Lionel's provocation, Sylvia's anger. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was incomplete. "Mrs. Grayson," Miss Marple said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about the knock. That's quite peculiar, isn't it, that it should return after so many years?" Eleanor Sitt's pen paused, and she looked up, her face pale, but composed. "Peculiar, yes," she said. "I but hoped it was over, but, well, here we are." "Have there been any changes recently?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle. "New visitors, perhaps, or events that might have stirred things up?" Eleanor hesitated, her eyes flicking to Clara, who seemed to shrink deeper into her chair. "Nothing significant," she said. "Sylvia Sitt's return from university, of course, and Mr. Trent Sitt's visit. But that Sitt's hardly new. Lionel comes and goes as he pleases." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "And yet the knock began again recently. Perhaps something in the village? A new rector? Or a change in the Manor Step staff?" Clara Sitt's head jerked up, her voice sharp. "There, Stett's no new rector. Mr. Poole Sitt's been here for years, and the staff, it's Stett's just Herald and the maids, same as always." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I only wondered if something might have prompted it. In my village, St. Mary Mead, small changes often ripple in unexpected ways." Eleanor forced a smile. "Hollowmere is quieter than most. We keep to ourselves mostly." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind turning over Clara's quick response. The mention of the vicar had struck a nerve, and she made a mental note to speak with Mr. Poole soon. His nervous laughter and sweaty brow suggested he knew more than he let on. But for now, she shifted her focus to the manor itself. "This house is quite old," she said. "I noticed the oak tree in the garden, such a sturdy thing. Amos said Margaret was fond of it." Eleanor Sitt's pen stilled again, and Clara Sitt's hands twitched in her lap. "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice careful. "Margaret loved the garden. She was sentimental about it." "Sentimental," Miss Marple repeated, her tone thoughtful. "I suppose she left many memories here. Did she have friends in the village? Someone she might have confided in?" Clara Sitt's eyes darted to Eleanor, then back to the fire. She kept to herself. "Mostly," she said. She was shy, not like Sylvia. Miss Marple nodded, noting the evasion. If the journal had suggested otherwise, Margaret had been planning to meet someone, possibly a suitor, and her secrecy implied a need for discretion. The initials E loomed large in her mind. Eleanor or someone else? She decided to tread lightly, letting the conversation drift to safer topics, the weather, the village fete, while her thoughts wove a tentative theory. The knock, she reasoned, was no prank. Its consistency. 3 raps, always at night, suggested purpose, perhaps a signal or a ritual. Margaret's journal had mentioned a knock the night she vanished, seen with a shadow by the oak. Aeneas had heard an argument, and the letter urged a midnight meeting. The pieces pointed to a planned rendezvous that had gone wrong, possibly interrupted by someone in the household. The knock's return now might mean someone was trying to revive the past, or cover it up. Her thoughts were interrupted by Sylvia Sett's arrival, her boots muddy from a walk, and her expression stormy. "This place is suffocating," she announced, dropping into a chair. "I went to the village, and even there, people are whispering about the knock. They think it's Margaret Sett's ghost." "Sylvia, please," Eleanor said, her voice weary. "Not that nonsense again." "That's not nonsense," Sylvia snapped. "You all pretend nothing happened, but Margaret didn't just vanish. Someone knows something, and that knock is proof." Clara flinched, her hands clutching her shawl. "Sylvia, you weren't even here then. You don't sit to know what it was like." "I know enough," Sylvia said, her eyes blazing, "and I'm tired of everyone acting like it's a fairy tale. Miss Marple, you're supposed to be clever. Tell me, what do you think the knock is?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. "I think, Miss Grayson, that the knock is a message. Whether it sits from a ghost or a living soul, it wants to be heard. The question is, who is it speaking to?" Sylvia Sett's defiance faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "Maybe it sits speaking to all of us," she said, her voice softer. "Maybe it sits saying we can keep pretending." Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough, Sylvia. I won't have this house turned into a stage for melodrama." She excused herself, her face pale, and left the room. Clara followed soon after, murmuring something about a headache. Sylvia lingered, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's. "You not like the others," she said. "You actually listen." "I find listening reveals more than speaking," Miss Marple said. "If you ever wish to share your thoughts, Miss Grayson, my door is open." Sylvia nodded, then left without another word. Miss Marple returned to her notebook, adding to her observations, knock, signal or ritual, tied to Margaret's meeting. Sylvia suspects cover-up, Eleanor evasive, Clara overly sensitive. "Vicar next?" She underlined message, her pencil lingering on the page. The pattern was emerging, a secret meeting, an argument, a disappearance, and a knock that refused to fade. The residents were bound to it, each in their own way, Eleanor by her silence, Clara by her fear, Sylvia by her anger. The Colonel and Lionel remained enigmas, and the vicar's nervousness hinted at a role yet to be uncovered. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her theory taking shape. The knock was a reminder, perhaps of guilt, perhaps of a truth someone feared would surface. She glanced at the window, where the oak tree stood like a sentinel. Tonight she would watch the garden, and tomorrow she would seek out the vicar. The manor's secrets were stirring, and Miss Marple was determined to hear them out. Chapter 9. The Locked Room. The afternoon in Hollowmere Manor was cloaked in a stillness that felt almost oppressive, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, seated in her room with her knitting, had spent the morning reflecting on the emerging pattern of the mystery. The knock, Margaret's disappearance, the journal, and the letter all pointed to a secret that had festered for 20 years. Her conversation with Sylvia had confirmed her suspicion that the knock was no mere prank. It was a message, perhaps a warning, and its timing suggested someone in the household was stirring the past. Determined to uncover more, she decided to explore the manor's upper floors, where forgotten rooms often held forgotten truths. She rose, tucking her notebook into her handbag, and made her way to the staircase, her steps soft on the worn runner. The second floor was a maze of corridors, their walls lined with portraits of stern-faced Graysons, whose eyes seemed to follow her. Most doors were ajar, revealing dusty guest rooms or storage spaces, but one at the far end of the east wing was locked, its brass handle tarnished but sturdy. Miss Marple paused, her fingers brushing the keyhole. In St. Mary Mead, a locked door was as good as an invitation to a curious mind, and she resolved to find a way inside. Descending to the parlour, she found Eleanor Grayson arranging flowers in a vase, her movements precise, but her face drawn. "Mrs. Grayson," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "I was exploring the house, such a fascinating place. I noticed a locked door in the east wing. Is it used?" Eleanor's hand froze, a rose slipping from her fingers. "The east wing," she said, her voice tight. "That's just storage. Old furniture, nothing of interest." "Old houses are full of surprises," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "Might I have a look? I'm terribly fond of antiques." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I suppose there's no harm. I'll fetch the key." She returned moments later with a heavy iron key, her expression guarded. They climbed the stairs together, the silence between them heavy. At the locked door, Eleanor inserted the key, her hand trembling slightly, and the lock clicked open with a groan. The door swung inward, revealing a small room that was both familiar and strange. A young woman's bedroom, frozen in time. A four-poster bed stood against one wall, its canopy draped with faded lace. A vanity held a silver brush and a cracked mirror, and a wardrobe loomed in the corner, its doors slightly ajar. Dust coated every surface, and the air was stale, as if the room had been sealed for years. "This was Margaret's room," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We left it as it was after." Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. The bed was neatly made, but a single pillow was askew, as if someone had sat there recently. On the vanity, a hairpin lay out of place, its shine too bright for 20 years of dust. She moved to the wardrobe and opened it, revealing dresses that smelled faintly of lavender. But it was the floor beneath that caught her attention, a loose floorboard, slightly raised, as if it had been lifted and not properly replaced. "Mrs. Grayson," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, "has anyone been in here recently?" Eleanor's face paled. "No, of course not. It's been locked since she disappeared." Before Miss Marple could respond, a sharp cry echoed from downstairs, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Eleanor turned, her eyes wide, and hurried out, Miss Marple following close behind. In the entrance hall, Clara Beaumont stood trembling, her hands clutching her shawl. Sylvia was beside her, her face pale but composed, while Lionel leaned against the banister, his grin absent for once. The colonel burst in from the garden, his boots muddy, his expression grim. "What's happened?" Eleanor demanded, her voice sharp. Clarisept's voice was a sob. I went to the east wing, looking for something. The door was open, and I saw her." "Saw who?" the colonel snapped, his face reddening. "Margaret," Clara whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "She was standing by the window, in her room. I swear it." "Nonsense," the colonel growled. "That room's been locked for years." "It wasn't Stet's locked just now," Sylvia said, her tone sharp. "I saw it open too, before Clara screamed. Someone said's been in there." Miss Marple Sipt's eyes flicked to Eleanor, whose hands were clenched tightly. "Mrs. Grayson, you opened the door for me just moments ago. Was it locked when you found it?" Eleanor nodded, her face ashen. "Yes, I said I'm certain of it. I had to use the key." "Then how?" Sylvia began, but Lionel interrupted, his voice low. "Maybe our ghostly knocker decided to take a stroll," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Or maybe someone sits playing a very clever game." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Let's Stet's have a look, shall we? It's Stet's best to be thorough." They returned to the room, the group trailing behind her like reluctant shadows. The door was indeed ajar, though Miss Marple was certain Eleanor had closed it. Inside, the room was as she'd left it, but the hairpin on the vanity was now missing, and the floorboard was pressed firmly into place. She knelt, her fingers tracing the edge, and with a gentle tug, it lifted, revealing a small hollow beneath. Inside was a single object, a locket, silver and tarnished, engraved with the initials MG. "Good heavens!" Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That was Margaret Sit's. She never took it off. Miss Marple lifted the locket, opening it to reveal a faded photograph of a young man, his features indistinct but his posture formal. "Does anyone recognize him?" she asked, holding it up. The colonel shook his head, his jaw tight. Clara looked away, her hands trembling. Sylvia Sit's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Lion leaned closer, his expression unreadable. "Looks old," he said. "Could be anyone." Miss Marple slipped the locket into her handbag, her mind racing. The open door, the missing hairpin, the hidden locket, all suggested someone had been here, perhaps moments before Clara's scream. But why? To plant evidence or to retrieve it? She turned to Clara, her voice gentle. "Mrs. Beaumont, you said you saw Margaret. Can you describe her?" Clara Sit's voice was unsteady. She was pale, in a white dress by the window. Her hair was dark, like in the portraits. But when I screamed, she was gone. Gone. Miss Marple repeated. "Did you see her leave?" Clara shook her head, tears welling. "No, she just vanished." The colonel snorted. "You imagined it, Clara. Too much talk of ghosts." Sylvia Sit's voice was sharp. "Then why was the door open, and what sits that locket doing here?" Miss Marple Sip's smile was serene, but her eyes were keen. "An excellent question, Miss Grayson. Perhaps someone hoped we find it, or feared we would." Eleanor ushered them out, locking the door behind them. "This is too much," she said, her voice trembling. "I shall have Herald check the locks. We can have this." As they dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the corridor, her thoughts turning over the conflicting accounts. Clara's vision was likely fear-driven, but the open door and the locket were real. Someone had been in the room, and the timing suggested they knew Miss Marple was close to uncovering something. She returned to her room and opened her notebook, adding, "Locked room opened, locket found, Margaret's, Clara's vision, hallucination or staged. Someone acting quickly to cover or reveal. Suspects all present, but who had access?" She underlined locket, her pencil lingering. The manor's secrets were no longer whispering, they were shouting. Miss Marple resolved to speak with the vicar next, for his nervous laughter echoed in her mind like the knock itself. Chapter 10. The Vicar Sits Confession. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Hollowmere Manor, softening the edges of the garden and lending the oak tree an almost spectral air. Miss Marple, wrapped in her shawl, walked briskly toward the village, her mind fixed on the events of the previous day. The discovery in Margaret's locked room, the locket, the open door, Clara's claim of seeing a figure had sharpened the mystery, and the knock remained its heartbeat. Her theory was taking shape. Someone in the household was orchestrating the knocks, perhaps to distract from a deeper truth or to expose it. The vicar, Mr. Poole, with his nervous laughter and evasive demeanour, was her next target for answers. The village church stood at the edge of Hollowmere, its stone steeple piercing the mist like a needle through fabric. The vicarage, a modest cottage beside it, was surrounded by a tidy garden where roses bloomed in defiance of the gloom. Miss Marple knocked gently on the door, her handbag clutched in one hand, her expression as serene as ever. Mr. Poole answered promptly, his round face flushed and his eyes darting nervously. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, his laugh high and forced. "What a surprise! Ha ha! Come in, come in. Would you care for tea?" "Thank you, Mr. Poole," Miss Marple said, stepping into the cosy parlour. The room was cluttered with books and papers, a crucifix hanging above the fireplace, and a faint smell of pipe smoke lingered in the air. She settled into an armchair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I thought we might have a chat. You seemed quite unsettled at dinner the other night." "Unsettled? Me?" Mr. Poole's laugh rang out again, but it faltered under her steady gaze. He busied himself with the tea tray, his hands trembling slightly. "Oh, it's just the manor, you know. Old houses, strange noises. Ha, ha, nothing to worry about." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. "I find old houses often carry their stories in their sounds, like that knock we all heard." Mrs. Grayson mentioned it began with Margaret Grayson's disappearance. "Were you here then, Mr. Poole?" The vicar's teapot clattered against a cup, and he set it down with care. "Yes, I was here," he said, his voice quieter now. "I was just taken up the post. A terrible time, truly. Poor Margaret, such a bright girl." The whole village was in shock. "I imagine so," Miss Marple said, accepting a cup of tea. "You must have known her well, being the vicar. Did she ever confide in you?" Mr. Poole's face reddened, and he sank into a chair, his fingers drumming on the armrest. "She came to church, of course. A dutiful girl. But confide? Well, not exactly. She was private, you see, kept her thoughts to herself." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. "I understand she may have had a suitor, someone the family didn't approve of. Did you ever hear of such a person?" The vicar's eyes widened, and he coughed, his laugh returning like a nervous tick. "A suitor? Oh, there were rumours. Ha ha ha. Village gossip. You know how it is. Nothing concrete, mind you." Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice soft but probing. "Gossip often has a grain of truth, Mr. Poole. I found a letter in the Manusept's library, addressed to Margaret, urging her to meet someone at the oak tree. It was signed with an E. Does that bring anyone to mind?" Mr. Poole's face paled, and his hand froze mid-gesture. For a moment he seemed to struggle for words, then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're a perceptive woman, Miss Marple. I suppose there's no harm in telling you now, after all these years, but you must promise to keep it in confidence." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone reassuring but her mind alert. "I'm only here to understand." The vicar took a deep breath, his eyes darting to the window, as if expecting an eavesdropper. "There was someone," he said, "a young man named Edward Langley. He was a tutor in the village, hired to teach the Grayson children. Margaret, she fell in love with him. They kept it secret, but I saw them once near the church, talking quietly. She was radiant, but nervous. Edward was a good man, but poor, not the sort her father would approve." Miss Marple nodded, her mind flashing to the locket and the faded photograph of a young man. "And what became of Edward?" Mr. Poole's face darkened. "He left the village the day after Margaret disappeared. People said he ran off, heartbroken or maybe guilty. There was talk of a scandal. Some said they planned to elope, but something went wrong. I tried to help, you see. I spoke to Margaret that week, urged her to be careful. She said she'd meet him one last time to decide their future." "At the oak tree?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle. The vicar nodded, his hands trembling. "Yes, she told me in confidence during a visit to the church. I promised not to tell her father. After she vanished, I wondered if I'd failed her. And then the knock started. 3 raps that very night. I heard it myself, from the vicarage. It chilled me to the bone." Miss Marple Sipt's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained. "And you believe the knock is tied to Margaret?" Mr. Poole hesitated, his voice barely audible. "I don't know what to believe. At first I thought it was guilt, my own, for not doing more. But it kept happening. Over the years, some in the village say it's her spirit seeking justice. Others think it's someone else, keeping the wound open. But as someone else..." Miss Marple's tone was curious, inviting more. The vicar shifted uncomfortably. There were tensions in the manor. Margaret's father was a hard man, and her brother Rupert, the colonel now, was protective, almost possessive. I heard rumours of an argument the night she vanished. Not with Edward, but with someone in the family. I don't know who. Miss Marple's needles, which she'd retrieved from her handbag, clicked softly as she listened. The vicar's story was revealing, but incomplete. He was holding something back. His nervousness, his quick glances, suggested fear of saying too much. "Thank you, Mr. Poole," she said. "You've been most helpful. One last thing, did anyone else know of Margaret and Edward's plans?" Mr. Poolstead's eyes flickered with unease. I may have mentioned it to someone, in confidence. I can stet recall who. It was so long ago." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind racing. The vicar Sept's lapse in memory was convenient, perhaps too convenient. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "You Sep's given me much to think about, Mr. Poole. I still let you get back to your duties." As she left the vicarage, the mist had begun to lift, revealing the village's thatched roofs and the manor in the distance. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts weaving together the new threads. Edward Langley, a forbidden suitor, a planned meeting at the Oak, an argument possibly with family, and the knock that began that night. The vicar's confession had filled in gaps, but his hesitation suggested he knew more, perhaps about who else had been involved. Back in her room, she opened her notebook, adding to her observations: Vicar confirms Edward Langley, Margaret's suitor. Meeting planned at Oak, night of disappearance. Argument with family. Vicar nervous, withholding, knows more, knockers justice or guilt. She underlined Edward, her pencil lingering on the page. The manor loomed in her mind, its walls heavy with secrets. The vicar's story pointed to a betrayal. Perhaps someone had discovered Margaret's plan and intervened. The locket, the knock, the open door, all were pieces of a puzzle that was growing clearer, yet more complex. Miss Marple resolved to watch the household closely tonight, for the knock was sure to come again, and with it perhaps another clue. Chapter 11. The Night Watch. The evening shadows stretched long across Hollowmere Manor, pooling in the corners of the entrance hall, where Miss Marple stood, her shawl draped over her shoulders. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if the house itself knew something was afoot. After days of hearing the mysterious knock, 3 sharp raps with no source, she had decided it was time to take action. The clues were mounting: Margaret's journal, the letter signed E, the locket in the locked room, Amos's tale of an argument, and the vicar's confession about Edward Langley. The knock was a thread tying them together, and Miss Marple was determined to catch its source. She had proposed a vigil at dinner, her suggestion delivered with such mildness that it caught the household off guard. "If we sit together tonight," she had said, "we might learn who or what is behind this knock. Curiosity, after all, is a great motivator." Her tone had been gentle, but her eyes had missed nothing. Eleanor's hesitation, the Colonel's scowl, Clara's panic, Lionel's amused smirk, and Sylvia's wary nod. Now, as the grandfather clock struck 11, the residents gathered in the drawing-room, its velvet curtains drawn tight against the night. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering light on the faces around the room. Eleanor sat stiffly on a settee, her hands clasped tightly. Colonel Grayson stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid, one hand resting on the mantel as if anchoring himself. Clara perched on the edge of an armchair, her shawl clutched like a shield. Lionel lounged in a corner, a glass of brandy in hand, his eyes glinting with mischief. Sylvia paced near the window, her auburn hair glowing in the firelight, her expression a mix of defiance and unease. Miss Marple settled into a high-backed chair near the door, her knitting in her lap, her needles clicking softly. "Thank you all for indulging me," she said, her voice calm. "I thought it best we face this mystery together. The knock has been most persistent, and I believe it wants our attention." "Attention," the Colonel growled, his mustache twitching. "It sets a blasted nuisance, that sets what it is. I say we lock the doors and ignore it." "Ignore it," Sylvia snapped, stopping her pacing. "It's been 20 years, Uncle Rupert. Ignoring it hasn't worked. Maybe Miss Marple sits right. Maybe we need to face it." Clara Sit's voice was a whisper. What if it sits her? Margaret, I mean, what if she sits trying to tell us something? "Nonsense," the Colonel said, but his voice lacked conviction, and his eyes flicked to the door. Lionel raised his glass, his grin sharp. "I stands all for a ghost hunt, Miss Marple. But what sends the plan? Sit here and wait for our phantom to knock." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "If we listen carefully, we may learn more than we expect. People and houses reveal themselves when pressed. Eleanor cleared her throat, her voice strained. I hope you served right, Miss Marple. This disturbance has gone on long enough. The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the faint ticking of the clock. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her eyes darting from face to face. Clara's hands trembled. Eleanor's posture was too rigid. The Colonel's jaw was tight. Lionel's nonchalance felt forced, and Sylvia's pacing had resumed, her boots tapping softly on the floor. The tension was palpable, each person a coiled spring, waiting for the knock to break the stillness. As midnight approached, the air grew colder, and the fire seemed to dim. Miss Marple's ears were attuned to every sound, the creak of the house, the rustle of leaves outside, the soft breaths of those around her. Then, at the stroke of 12, it came 3 sharp knocks, resounding from the front hall, each one deliberate and unyielding. Clara gasped, her shawl slipping to the floor. The Colonel strode toward the door, his face red with determination. Right, that's it, he muttered, flinging the door open and stepping into the hall. Sylvia followed, her eyes blazing, and Lionel trailed behind, his grin replaced by a wary alertness. Eleanor rose but hesitated, her hand gripping the back of the settee. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and joined them, her steps unhurried, but her senses sharp. The hall was dark, the oak door closed, its brass knocker gleaming faintly. The Colonel yanked it open, revealing the empty porch, the gravel undisturbed under the moonlight. Nothing, he growled, slamming the door shut, just like always. Sylvia Sext's voice was sharp. It's text, not nothing. Someone texts doing this, and I want to know who. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the hall, noting a faint scuff mark on the floor near the door, barely visible in the dim light. She knelt, her fingers brushing the mark. It was fresh, unlike the worn parquet around it. Curious, she murmured, rising. Mrs. Grayson, is the door always locked at night? Eleanor nodded, her face pale. Yes, Harold checks it every evening. It was locked tonight. I am sure of it. Then how? Sylvia began, but a sudden noise cut her off, a crash from upstairs, like glass shattering. The group froze, their eyes darting to the ceiling. Stay here, the Colonel ordered, but Sylvia ignored him, bolting up the stairs. Miss Marple followed, her pace steady, with Lionel and Eleanor close behind. Clara remained in the doorway, her hands pressed to her mouth. On the second floor, they found the source, a broken vase in the east wing corridor, its shards scattered near the locked door of Margaret's room. Sylvia stood over it, her face pale, but her eyes fierce. Someone was here, she said, pointing to the door which was slightly ajar. That wasn't open earlier. The Colonel pushed past her, shoving the door wide. The room was as Miss Marple had seen it, but the locket was gone from the vanity where she'd left it for safekeeping. In its place was a single rose, its petals fresh as if plucked moments ago. Who did this? The Colonel demanded, his voice booming. Who set's been in here? Lionel leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. Our ghost seems to have a flair for drama, he said, but his voice lacked its usual mockery. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she examined the rose. This is from the garden, she said. Amos Sit's roses, I believe. Someone was here, and not long ago. Sylvia rounded on Eleanor. You had the key, Aunt Eleanor. Did you let someone in? Eleanor Sit's face flushed. Of course not. I locked it after we found the locket. I swear it. Then how did they get in? Sylvia Setz's voice was accusing, her hands clenched. Someone sits playing games, and I sits sick of it. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. Let's not jump to conclusions. A confrontation benefits no one, but it's clear someone wanted us to find this rose and to know the locket is gone. The Colonel Sip's face was thunderous. I still have Harold search the grounds. If someone Sip's sneaking about, I still find them. As they returned downstairs, Miss Marple's mind raced. The knock had been a distraction, drawing them to the hall while someone slipped into Margaret's room. The rose was a message, perhaps a taunt, and the missing locket suggested someone feared its significance. She glanced at the group. Eleanor's strained denial, Sylvia's anger, Lionel's guarded curiosity, the Colonel's bluster, Clara's absence. Each was a suspect, but the scuff mark and the rose pointed to someone with access to the manor and the garden. In her room, she opened her notebook, adding vigil disrupted by knock, followed by crash, locket gone, rose left Amos's garden, door ajar despite lock, someone inside manor, acting swiftly, motive, hide locket's secret or provoke reaction. She underlined rose, her pencil lingering. The confrontation had revealed more than the knock itself, a house divided, secrets spilling like broken glass. Miss Marple resolved to speak with Amos again, for the rose was no accident, and the truth was closer than ever. Chapter 12. The Truth Unravels. The drawing-room of Hollowmere Manor was bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, its heavy curtains drawn against the evening chill. Miss Marple sat in her usual high-backed chair, her knitting resting in her lap, her needles still for once. The household had gathered at her request, their faces a mix of apprehension and curiosity. Eleanor Grayson sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly. Colonel Grayson stood by the fireplace, his jaw set. Clara Beaumont clutched her shawl, her eyes darting nervously. Lionel Trent lounged with a forced nonchalance, his grin absent, and Sylvia Grayson perched on the edge of a settee, her gaze sharp and expectant. The vicar, Mr. Poole, had been invited as well, his nervous laugh silenced by the weight of the moment. Miss Marple Sip's voice was calm but firm, cutting through the tension. "Thank you all for joining me," she said. "I believe it's time we addressed the matter of the knock, and the truth it's time's been trying to tell us." Eleanor Stet's lips parted, but she said nothing, her eyes fixed on Miss Marple. The Colonel cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "About time we put this nonsense to rest. What have you found, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her eyes were keen. "The knock is no nonsense, Colonel. It's a message, one that Sit's been echoing for 20 years, since Margaret Grayson vanished. I pieced together the clues, and I believe I know who is behind it, and why." A murmur ran through the room. Clara Sett's hands trembled, and Sylvia leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Who? Tell us, Miss Marple." Miss Marple raised a hand, her tone steady. "Let's begin with Margaret. She was a young woman in love, planning to meet Edward Langley, her suitor, at the oak tree on the night she disappeared. A letter I found in the library, signed E, urged her to meet him at midnight. Her journal confirmed this, mentioning a knock, 3 raps, that she heard that night, along with a shadow by the oak. Amos the gardener overheard an argument near the gate, and the knock began that very night." The vicar shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. "I told you, Miss Marple, I knew of Edward, but he left the village after." "Yes, Mr. Poole." Miss Marple interrupted gently. You told me of Edward, but you also said you shared Margaret Sitt's confidence with someone, though you claimed not to recall who. That was a significant lapse, for it set the stage for what followed. She turned to the group, her eyes moving from face to face. Margaret's plan was discovered, not by chance, but because someone betrayed her trust, that someone confronted her that night, leading to an argument, one that ended in tragedy. Margaret didn't run away or drown in the river. She was harmed, and the knock has been a reminder ever since. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Harmed? You mean murdered? Miss Marple's sixth's expression was grave. I'm afraid so. The locket we found in her room, the rose left in its place, the open door, all were attempts to either hide or reveal the truth. The knock, I believe, was meant to keep that truth alive. Sylvia Sixth's voice was fierce. Who did it, Miss Marple? Who Sixth's been doing this? Miss Marple's gaze settled on Clara, whose face had gone ashen. Mrs. Beaumont, she said softly. You've been frightened since I arrived. At first, I thought it was fear of the knock. But it's more than that, isn't it? You were in the manor the night Margaret disappeared. You saw something or did something. Clara Stick's eyes widened, and she shook her head frantically. No, I didn't stit. I loved Margaret. I would never. You saw her, Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering. You claimed to see her in the locked room, but it wasn't set a ghost. It was a memory. Wasn't set it. A memory of that night, when you followed her to the oak, perhaps to warn her, perhaps to stop her. Clara Sitt's sob broke the silence, her hands trembling. I didn't mean to. I was young, jealous. Margaret had everything: beauty, love. I overheard her talking to Edward, planning to elope. I told Rupert, thinking he stop her, that sits all. I didn't know, he sits. The Colonel Sepp's face darkened, his voice a low growl. Clara, be silent. But Miss Marple Sitt's eyes shifted to him, her tone calm but piercing. Colonel Grayson, you were Margaret Sitt's brother, protective to a fault. When Clara told you of Margaret Sitt's plan, you confronted her, didn't you? At the oak that night. The argument Amos heard wasn't with Edward, it was with you. The room was still, the fire crackle. The only sound, the Colonel Sitt's hands clenched, his face red. That's preposterous, he said, but his voice shook. I loved my sister. I believe you did, Miss Marple said, but love can be possessive. You couldn't bear the thought of her leaving, defying the family. The argument escalated, and in a moment of anger, something happened, an accident perhaps. Margaret was harmed, and you hid her fate, perhaps with help. Eleanor Sitt's voice was a whisper. Rupert, tell me it isn't true. The Colonel's shoulders slumped, his face crumpling. It was an accident, he said, his voice breaking. She wouldn't listen. I grabbed her arm. She pulled away, fell, hit her head on the tree. She was gone before I could do anything. I panicked, hid her in the woods. I thought it would be better if everyone believed she'd run away. Sylvia Sitt's face was pale, her voice trembling. You let us think she abandoned us all these years. Miss Marple Sixth's voice was gentle. And the knock, Colonel, that was your doing, wasn't it? A way to keep her memory alive, to punish yourself. The Colonel shook his head, his eyes haunted. Not me. I couldn't bear it. It was someone else. Not me. I couldn't bear it. It was someone else. Miss Marple turned to Clara, her gaze steady. Mrs. Beaumont, you been leaving the roses, haven't that you? And orchestrating the knocks, you knew what happened, and guilt drove you to remind the household, to force the truth out. Clara's tears fell freely now. I couldn't live with it, she sobbed. I told Rupert, and it led to her death. I found her locket years later, in the garden, and I kept it in her room, hoping someone would find it. The knocks, I used a hidden mechanism in the hall, an old servant's bell. I wanted everyone to remember, to face it. Lionel let out a low whistle, his eyes wide. Quite the performance, Clara. You had us all fooled. Miss Marple's smile was sad. Guilt is a heavy burden. Mrs. Beaumont, you sought to atone, but it was time for the truth to speak for itself. Eleanor rose, her face pale but resolute. Rupert, Clara, we sit or go to the authorities. This can stay hidden any longer. The colonel nodded, his voice hoarse. I stum ready. Me stum ready. I stum carried it too long. Sylvia stood, her eyes blazing with tears. You both took her from us. I hope you live with that forever. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her heart heavy, but her mind clear. The knock had been Clara's cry for justice, a signal to unearth a tragedy buried too long. As the household dispersed, the manor seemed quieter, its secrets finally laid bare. Chapter 13. The Echo That Lingers. The morning sun broke through the clouds over Hollowmere Manor, casting a golden light across the garden where the old oak stood, its branches swaying gently as if relieved of a long-held burden. Inside, the drawing-room was quiet, the air softer now that the truth about Margaret Grayson's fate had been laid bare. Miss Marple sat in her familiar high-backed chair, her knitting in her lap, her needles moving with a steady rhythm that mirrored the calm that had settled over the household. The knock, it seemed, had finally been answered, but Miss Marple knew that truth, like a tapestry, often revealed one last twist in its pattern. Eleanor Grayson sat across from her face weary but resolute, a cup of tea untouched on the table beside her. Sylvia was by the window, her auburn hair catching the light, her expression a mix of grief and relief. The colonel and Clara were absent, having left with the local constable to give their statements, their confessions weighing heavily on the manor's air. Lionel Trent had departed early, his usual grin replaced by a subdued nod, as if the unravelling of the mystery had dimmed his taste for provocation. The vicar, Mr. Poole, had returned to his vicarage, his nervous laughter silenced by the gravity of the truth. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her voice gentle but clear. Mrs. Grayson. Miss Grayson. I believe the manor will find peace now. The knock was Clara Seck's way of forcing the truth to light, and Colonel Grayson Sitt's confession has closed a chapter long left open. Eleanor nodded, her hands clasped tightly. I can believe Rupert kept it hidden all these years, and Clara, I thought her fear was just nerves. I never imagined she carried such guilt. Sylvia turned from the window, her voice soft but firm. They took Margaret from us, but at least we know now. She didn't run away. She didn't abandon us. Her eyes glistened, but she held her chin high. Thank you, Miss Marple. You saw what we couldn't. Miss Marple's smile was kind, but her eyes were thoughtful. People often see what they wish to, Miss Grayson. But there's one piece of this puzzle that still troubles me, the locket and the photograph inside. It was of a young man, presumably Edward Langley. Yet the vicar said Edward left the village the day after Margaret disappeared. Why then was the locket hidden in her room, only to be revealed now? Eleanor frowned, her brow furrowing. I assumed it was Margaret Sitz left behind when it happened. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. That's what I thought at first. But the locket's condition, it was tarnished but not as worn as it should have been, hidden for 20 years, and the rose left in its place, fresh from the garden, suggested someone placed it there recently, perhaps to point us toward the truth or to misdirect us. Sylvia Sitz's eyes narrowed. Misdirect?
You think someone else was involved?
Miss Marple nodded slowly. I believe there's a final twist to this tale. Clara admitted to the knocks, using a hidden bell mechanism in the hall, and to placing the rose, but the locket, I suspect it was placed in the room, not by Clara, but by someone who wanted to ensure the truth came out, someone who knew more than they let on. The room was still, the only sound the faint creak of the manor settling. Eleanor Sitz's hands tightened, and Sylvia leaned forward, her voice urgent. Who, Miss Marple? Who else could know? Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. I believe it was Amos, the gardener. He's been here longer than any of us, tending the garden, watching the house. He told me he saw Margaret that night, clutching a letter, and heard an argument. But he also said he found something years later in the garden, something he kept hidden. I suspect it was the locket which he placed in Margaret's room to stir the truth when Clara's knocks began again. Eleanor gasped. Amos. But why wouldn't he say anything? Guilt, perhaps, Miss Marple said. Or loyalty. Amos was fond of Margaret, brought her tea, knew her habits. He may have felt he failed her by not intervening that night. When Clara's knocks resumed, he saw a chance to force the truth out, but indirectly to protect himself. The rose was Clara's, but the locket was Amos's final act of confession. Sylvia Sitz's face hardened. So he knew all along, and said nothing. He let us live with the lies. Miss Marple Sitz's smile was sad. People carry their burdens in different ways, Miss Grayson. Amos chose silence, but his actions spoke in the end. The locket was his way of ensuring Margaret Sitz's story wasn't forgotten. Eleanor rose, her voice trembling, but resolute. I still speak to Amos. He deserves to know we understand, and that we stir grateful. In a way, this house has been haunted too long. Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. Hollowmere will heal now, Mrs. Grayson. The truth once spoken has a way of quieting even the loudest echoes. As Eleanor and Sylvia left to prepare for the days ahead, Miss Marple packed her knitting, her mind at rest. The knock had been Clara's cry for justice, the Colonel's guilt had been exposed, and Amos's silent act had sealed the resolution. The manor was no longer a prison of secrets, and Hollowmere could breathe again. Later that day, as she prepared to return to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple walked to the garden one last time. The oak tree stood sentinel, its carved initials Miss Jill and E.L. faint but clear in the sunlight. She smiled, her heart light. Margaret's story was complete, and the knock would echo no more. And so, dear listeners, the mystery of Hollowmere Manor comes to a close, its secrets laid bare under Miss Marple's watchful eye. The knock that didn't echo has found its voice, and the village is at peace. But what of your own corners of the world? Are there mysteries lurking in the shadows of your town or village? Share your location with us in the comments. Perhaps you're reading from a place with its own hidden tales. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that unravel the heart of human nature. The next puzzle awaits, and Miss Marple will be ready. Will you?